we are here, season 2, and today I'm joined by the fabulous Aoife McMahon. And if you can hear a giggle in my voice, it's because this is our third time to get this started due to tech issues. So Aoife, I am going to introduce her, but she's going to tell you a little bit more about herself as well. So Aoife is a registered dietitian and intuitive eating counsellor who works with people who have eating disorders and disordered eating. And to be fair, I think I'm going to say she promotes that we work on health promoting behaviors rather than weight loss or dieting. You can find her on Instagram at that Irish Dietitian. And she's a fab watch and a fab person to follow and have in your positive space of the internet. So Aoife, tell me a little bit more about you.
Thanks, Mel, Denise. Thank you. And thanks for having me on today. Yeah, I think that sums me up quite well. Sometimes I use different terminology. You know, it's the intuitive eating, weight inclusive, anti-diet, all of these different terms which describe, as you say, recognizing the limits of weight loss and the science behind weight loss or lack thereof, and also the science that supports building that positive relationship with food, building a positive relationship with our bodies. And as you say, focusing on the actual health promoting behaviors rather than hyper focusing on one health outcome, i.e. weight, which isn't always the best marker, let's just say.
It's a bit of a difficult one, isn't it, for people to sometimes hear that piece, because I suppose we've all grown up. I even heard it in a dentist's office recently about weight, and it's just ingrained in us. But yeah, how do you I suppose, what would you say to somebody who's probably hearing this maybe it's their first time?
Yeah, and
what would you say?
it is quite opening up strong, isn't it? Talking about the weight piece, and as you say, it is everywhere. It's reinforced everywhere, and it does sit when we hear about, you know, putting weight loss down off the pedestal we have it on at the moment. That can really jar with what we know or what we believe and understand about health just now. So it's understandable if you're listening right now and you're thinking, what weight isn't to do with, or weight is the best marker of my health. And I would say, I suppose the best way to introduce this, or the way that I tend to introduce this concept, is really just to start to connect with your own lived experience of how the pursuit of weight loss has actually treated you. Because we're always told weight loss should work, and if it doesn't work, it's your fault, you're the problem. As a society in general, you know, when we reflect on our own relationship with the pursuit of weight loss, does that work? One, first of all, does it work long term? And second of all, how has it treated you? Has it been your friend, or has it been something that causes you more distress or impacts your relationship with food? Has it impacted your ability to sit and have a cake and coffee with friends? You know, these are things that contribute to our health as well. So when someone's come across this for the first time, I think it can be useful just to reflect on how the pursuit of weight loss has treated you.
Something I always say to my clients is that we've been on a diet before, and it took a number of people for me to hear this and really and feel the pain that was happening. So when they've been on the diet and maybe they'd lost the weight, and then when they had lost the weight, the fear that they were living with, so this life that they were building themselves up to finally be able to live, they couldn't live it because they were afraid all the time of that weight loss coming back, or the weight coming back on. So what they were even working towards was they were left with nothing in the end, because it was just more worry and more pain and more shame, and not getting to live the life that they really were hoping and aspiring toward.
Yeah, and it is a big hope, the hope of weight loss that a lot of us have, and a lot of us have been taught to constantly chase. And as you say, you know, there can be moments where people lose the weight, and what's not questioned as well, in addition to what's short-lived or what can be achieved and then is lost when the weight regains, but also what's not questioned is how that person lost the weight. Because often someone might lose the weight, but they might be starving themselves to get there, or they might be exhausting themselves with agonizing over checking calories and eating the quote unquote right way, and really driving themselves into the ground. And that isn't really spoken about. You know, if someone's lost weight, it's just seen as this good thing. We don't question the how or the what's going on behind it, really, do we?
I was saying that to someone the other day, like, you know, that it's been a long time since I've greeted someone and said, "You look amazing," or "You look fabulous." You know, you typically, if you meet people after at the summertime, and it's like, "Oh my God, you look great," and usually it's followed by, "You've lost so much weight." And I remember connecting in with going, but that means nothing about how that person feels. And for me, connection is so much more than just the physical of how great you look. Of
Mm.
course, you can, you know, there's times I admire people's clothes, I admire how they choose to dress, or I admire their hair. But it's like when you make that comment, "You look great," you have no idea. You have no idea what the other person is feeling on the inside. And I think it's, isn't it more about just changing the narrative so we just gently remove that language? Like none of us knew this years ago. So maybe we're just trying to change the narrative so that we kind of ask, well, how's your year been? Or how has your day been? I've heard a lot and I've read a lot and we see it a lot about sugar detoxes and people being told that they're addicted to sugar and they're doing the 3 week out of sugar. And then I have my own thoughts and opinions on this, but I wanted to talk to you and I wanted to have I wanted to have an expert in the room with me so that we can tease this out. Are we actually addicted to sugar?
That is the fabulous question. And it's something that is debated and has been debated for a very, very long time. And addiction, as you say, it's everywhere. You know, the idea that sugar is either toxic or addictive, or that we need to purge ourselves of sugar, we need to cut it out because it's absolutely detrimental to our health. Like, if we think about the type of messaging that we receive to do with sugar, it is really intense, it's really emotional, it's really strong. Um, and also the different types of diets and the quote unquote solutions, as you say, the detoxes and everything like this, it's so strong. And before we get into this, actually, I kind of wanted to mention that the feeling of being addicted to sugar or feeling addicted to sugar is a very valid and real feeling. That feeling of
Mm.
I can't control myself around sugary foods, I can't stop eating those kinds of foods, or that they have some kind of control over you and you've got that impulse to have them on one level or another. That is a very real feeling. At the same time, what can be really useful, and I find that when I go through this with clients, with people,
Mm.
understanding whether there's a scientific basis and whether the model of sugary foods being an addictive substance is actually helpful, or if it's holding us back, you know? And so that's why I think it's really useful to dive into the science and look and see, right, is this model of addiction actually supported by the scientific literature?
Yeah, because like a feeling is psychological. And you would have that felt sense, you'll have that feeling, but it doesn't mean that it's true physiologically in your physical body that you are
Yes.
addicted. And I think food is
Yes.
very different to the maybe the substances that we compare sugar addiction to, because we need to have food every day.
Yes. Yeah, it's very different when you think about, yeah, first of all, in terms of a model of addiction and how you heal from addiction, when we're thinking about substance abuse or substance dependence, whether that's alcohol, whether that's drugs, the treatment is abstinence. Whereas when it comes to sugar, the treatment is actually very different from abstinence. And if you've ever tried to cut out sugar before, um, it's not the way forward. It's something that doesn't work long term. It's not a treatment that's advisable when it comes to dealing with sugar addiction.
Do you want to dip into the science a little bit?
So one of the research pieces that I like to look at, and it kind of stems from a headline, you know, there's a headline that frequently surfaces, and that is that sugar is as addictive as cocaine, right? Really inflammatory, makes you think, oh my gosh, sugar is so addictive. It's as addictive as a class A drug, right? And the research paper behind this, it could be really useful to look at. So the research paper behind this, and the one that they used to kind of support this title, was a rodent study. It was a study where researchers looked at rats and rats' response to consuming sugar. When we're looking at nutritional science, sometimes we first look at animals and then we go on to look at people in order to see what the impact of certain nutritional behaviors or eating behaviors is. So in this particular research paper, what they did was, or what they showed was that when rats consumed sugar, they experienced, or there was a piece in their brain, a section in their brain, the pleasure pathway, which ignited when they consumed sugar. So what the researchers concluded, because we see the same light up when we're looking at the drug research. So when we look at drug research, it's the same pleasure pathway. It's that dopamine pathway, dopamine being that feel-good, pleasurable neurotransmitter. We see that dopamine pathway also light up in response to drug use, like cocaine. So we're starting to see this story, and it kind of makes sense, and it kind of seems to be logical, right? If the rats eat the sugar, that results in a dopamine pathway light up, and if the rats consume drugs, it's the same dopamine pathway which lights up, right? So there is some semblance of logic there. What the really important piece is, and this is what we've seen over time. So there was a 2016 study which collated all of the research up until that point. And what they found was that in these studies, the rats were underfed. So they were in a state where they hadn't had enough nutrition, they hadn't had enough access to food or sugar. And we know already in human and in animal research that when a human being or when an animal is deprived of food being one of our most basic primal needs, your body will make certain changes to try and encourage you and drive you to eat, right? And one of these changes that your body will do is it will alter your dopamine, your pleasure response to food to try and encourage you to eat that food. So it makes sense then that in these studies, because in these studies, the rats weren't fed enough, and that was part of the study design, it makes sense that their dopamine response to the sugar was actually ramped up. When you think about yourself, if you've accidentally skipped a meal or if you've not eaten enough, you can smell bacon sizzling from miles away. You know, your body really enacts change within your body to drive you to get that food source. And so this is what we're seeing in the study. And when they did that 2016 study, one of the things that they concluded is that we only see addiction-like responses to sugar when there's what they said intermittent access. So we only tend to see this addiction type behavior when there has been some form of restriction in terms of the sugar. And that was what they concluded there.
Food is meant to be rewarding, but our brain is wired for survival and it's wired for a reward, which is when we do something that we enjoy, we want more of it. And if we think about, I suppose, looking statistically, and I know we don't have accurate figures, but we do have guesstimates of 50 to 75% of people are struggling with disordered eating, which what I would see clinically is that most people are underfed. So we have a big problem with this perceived sugar addiction. Don't we?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, 100%. And I would say, I would see very similar, Denise, as well. And I also find that people might not initially relate to being an undereater. As you say, there's a couple of things that your body desires. You know, nutrition is a basic need. It's a primal need. We need it. We actually need it multiple times a day, every single day, in order to function optimally, to feel well in ourselves, to do what we need to do. So that we need it regularly from when we wake up. And also, as you say, pleasure is core to one of the kind of devices or ways that our body gets us to do things that we need to do. And when we don't get pleasure from food, or even if, for example, you know, you're eating a pleasurable food, like for me, it'd be cake. If you're eating cake and all the while you're agonizing, you're thinking, does this fit into my plan? does this fit into my calories? I quote unquote shouldn't be eating this. It's stopping that ability to get the actual pleasure and be present with the food. And that has a significant impact. And that can be a form of restriction as well, you know?
Massive. The thoughts, I was on my yoga mat this morning and I was like, my God, like everything starts with thoughts. And that's
Yes.
not how we want our eating to be, or even our practice with our exercise. It comes from the body, because when the thoughts get involved, it gets super complicated. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's like if you're interrupting your eating with thoughts about how good or how bad this is for you, then you can easily
Mm,
stray away from the connection with the food and under or overeat.
yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Because it impacts your perceived satisfaction from that food. If you were to take,
Mm.
yeah, if you were to take two people, one person is eating the cake and one person is eating the cake but thinking all of these thoughts, I should or shouldn't be eating this. The person who sits down notices, the pleasurable taste, the texture, how it makes them feel, takes in the world around them, chats with their friend, looks at the sun outside, all of these different things, has a really satisfying experience, and then moves on with their day. Whereas when you think about the person who's and moves on, yes. And when you think about the person who eats the cake, but all the while is thinking about, should I eat this cake? Shouldn't I eat this cake? Does it fit into X, Y, and Z? They're not going to actually have received that satisfaction from that cake, and then they'll potentially want more, and it goes on like that.
Or this is where I would say to people, maybe that IBS is coming from because the digestive system is full with stress hormones and you ain't going to
Yep.
produce no enzymes to help break down your food. So was it the
Yes.
bread, or was it the thoughts that you were having about the bread or the cake or the
Yeah.
McDonald's or whatever it is?
Yeah, Denise, do you know there was this study, right? Found it, I think it was last year. So there was this study, I think it was in the 1970s, so it was a while back. And they had two people drink water, and it was mineralized water, so there was different minerals in there that your body could absorb. And they had one person drink the water with no distraction, and then the other person drink the water, and they had two people talk to them about two different topics. I think it was like finances and like space travel or something, like really, really distracting. And they looked at how much of the minerals were absorbed, and they actually found that the people who were distracted, it impacted their digestion of mineralized water, and the minerals weren't absorbed as much as the group that wasn't distracted.
And when you say to your clients, actually, this whole eating thing is quite simple.
Yeah.
And you tell them something like remove the distraction and you don't need to worry about really as much what's on your plate. Just remove the distraction. That's a whole,
Hmm.
it's an easy concept, but it's a difficult one to practice,
Yeah,
isn't it? Yeah.
100% in the day that we live in and at the time as well, or at the times that we live in at the moment.
You had another point you wanted to mention. I'm going to bring it back to see if you remember it on that study. Yeah.
Yes, I think it kind of tied into what you were saying. So,
Okay.
um, yeah, the rats experienced that restriction. It was physical restriction. They didn't have access to the food. But then also from a pleasure perspective, it was kind of touching on the pleasure perspective. We don't just experience dopamine responses in relation to sugar and in relation to cocaine. They're not the only things that we get dopamine kicks from. We get dopamine kicks from seeing a loved one, seeing a friend, having a dance, going for a walk, all of these different types of things. And so we have to think, are all of these things addictive substances, and what are we gonna, how do we work out what's an addiction, what's not an addiction?
I know you'll probably have done some reading of Gabor Mate, and he would have that concept of, we could be addicted to anything. We can be addicted to shopping. We can be addicted to compliments.
Yeah.
It's that pleasure receptor. And let's, before we get into it, well, I'm going to leave you go with the treatment piece, but part of it is recognizing what pleasure feels like for us and how do we want to derive our pleasure.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And there's things that we can work with, When we're thinking about everything can potentially be an addictive substance or whatever it is, there's things that we can work with, whether it's food, you know, for eating too much sugar, it's not going to drive your family into debt and completely socially, you know, impact your job and all of these different types of things. There's, you know, like sugar, exercise, compliments, validation, all of these different things aren't life ruining in the way that being addicted to alcohol, being addicted to drugs can really have an impact to those aspects of our lives. And though that needs to be a clear distinction, that needs to be a clear distinction, you know?
It's so true because we do harm by putting them on the same platform. That a sugar addiction is on the same as an alcohol or a drug addiction. It's very much so not. Let's go back to that piece that your client says, I do feel it, but I feel addicted to sugar. What about that? So what do we do with that?
Yeah. And just like starting off this podcast, I think the most important thing is not invalidating it, because we can say X, Y, and Z about the science, but that felt sense of being addicted to sugar and being out of control needs to be validated and acknowledged and welcomed into the room. Because whenever we try to, you know, push things out or cut things out and say that things don't exist, they tend to actually hold more power over us rather than when we welcome them into the room and talk about them. Um, when I'm working with someone, it does tend to be around, because when we're thinking about the research and when we're thinking about sugar addiction, and what tends to happen is that the subject is restricting, and then their body is sensing that they've not had enough nutrition and what their body is doing, because we need to remember your body is always doing the best that it can with the tools that it has, right? And so what the body is doing is it is driving you to eat an energy dense food, because it is just trying to make up for any lost energy that it's experienced throughout the day. So recognizing there's nothing wrong with you, you are not a problem. That this is your body just trying to cope in the ways that it knows right now. So that needs to be acknowledged as well. Moving forward, it's about identifying whether there is restriction, and as we said, it can be physical restriction, whether that's overt, like skipping meals or cutting out certain food groups or completely cutting out snacks or cutting out chocolate or whatever it is. Sometimes it can be more subtle, like you may be hungry for a certain amount of food, but you don't quite eat enough food to meet that hunger level. Whether that's you're hungry for a burger and chips and you decide to go for a burger and a salad instead, and you're not quite fully satisfied from that. That's a more subtle way of being physically restricted. So looking into those, and then also looking at more psychological restriction. And that's what we were kind of talking about earlier, where you're allowing yourself to eat the cake, but actually all the while, yeah, you're thinking, shouldn't be eating this. So you are having the food, but your body's not actually accessing that full satisfaction from the food. And I think when we're exploring those two pieces, a lot comes up from that. And there tends to be some kind of pathways, or we can chart some journeys to reestablish and get back into nourishing ourselves, feeding ourselves, making sure we're eating regularly. The pleasure piece and connecting with food and dealing with the psychological restriction is challenging. Dealing with the physical restriction is challenging. There's steps, there's hurdles, there's messages that we've really internalized, and you know, there's all of these barriers along the way. So it's identifying what's going on and developing a relationship with that.
I think, and then there is so many steps, and there's a process, and there's people often say, you know, the first step is the awareness. And even on my own journey for lots of different things, when you get to the awareness, you're like, holy shit, what do I do with that now?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
takes time to practice what
Yeah.
to do with the awareness. And that's, I suppose, where conversations like this, or leaning into a one-to-one support if you can, or even group support, can help you tease out what is it that you're seeing, and what is it that you're feeling, and what is it that's happening for you in that
Mm-hmm.
moment. And let's see, can we can we learn? This is a question that's been coming up for me all week, is how are we about learning about our own behaviors? And we can be a little bit defensive and a little bit sad and guilty and frustrated. And yet there is that process of, if you can work through that, there's something really lovely on the other side.
There is, and this is why, and I'm sure you're the same as well, but this is why I just adore this work. I just adore this work. And this, yeah, and this work, it can be, as you say, people come from all different, they have different stories. They have different environments that they've grown up in, different things that they've been told about food and their body and the media and everything around us that impacts our relationship with food. And we do hold the hope of being in a different body really, really tightly. Um, and that can be really scary to even think about. And again, with the addiction piece and with sugary food, and the idea of learning to work with sugary food can be incredibly scary. You know, for one person, it might be more subtle and more mild, and they might feel, actually, you know what, I am under eating a little bit there. I'll eat more. I'll allow myself to have a whatever it is at whatever time during the day, and I'll enjoy it. And they're able to do that. For some people, and this is not uncommon as well, but for some people, it is simply overwhelming to even contemplate the idea of welcoming in these foods or learning to have some kind of a relationship with them. And as you say, that's where it can be so useful to get one-to-one group support from someone like ourselves who deals with this type of thing. I know a lot of people might think, I'm not unwell enough, I'm not, you know, it's not bad enough, or that I don't deserve support, but you deserve the support, you really do. And as it really, it's really life-changing stuff, you know.
It is. And okay, I'm going to go back here to your dietitian. So you're medically trained to work with people when they are looking, when they have a medical condition. I'm a nutritional therapist, which means we would look more preventative health care, and we're looking at supporting somebody's health. Both of us have the understanding of nutrition science. And yet, what I really hear is there's so much work on the behaviors of hearing somebody's story.
Yeah, yeah. It's like that narrative therapy piece. If you're able to tell your story in that non-judgmental behavioral or non-judgmental environment, and it's focused on the behavioral piece, it can be really, really transformative. Yeah.
For you, is this, even if somebody has a medical condition, they can dip into intuitive eating and these practices? This work will really help them, because once they can
Yes.
open up to you, you can then help
Yeah.
them to bring foods that might be, or practices
Mm-hmm.
that might be helpful for their body into their way of living. Fair?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. So in terms of like, you know, I know this is slightly different, but the eating disorder side of things, like if you have a diagnosed eating disorder, that is something that I can work with, as well as people who don't have a diagnosed eating disorder. But also if you have health conditions such as polycystic ovary syndrome, diabetes, insulin resistance, irritable bowel syndrome, all of these different types of things, I work with people who have, we're all complex human beings. We don't tend to present in one simple way. And so there's many people that have these conditions. And there has been many a time where I have played the role of supporting to advocate, you know, not only as we started off with, identifying that health behaviors are so much more effective at focusing on, rather than a simple outcome measure such as weight, which we've alluded to earlier. When you see someone and who's lost weight, we don't know what the story is behind that. We don't know what's going on. We don't know how they've lost that weight or anything like that. And we don't know if that weight loss is going to be long term. But yeah, coming back, when it comes to these conditions, it's about recognizing what actually supports your health in terms of nutrition. And there's an advocacy piece, because there is a lot of pressure from friends, from family, even within the healthcare system, where we are pressured just weight loss, weight loss, weight loss. When, I mean, if you're listening, you've probably tried to lose weight before. I'm not sure. And when we're looking at statistics, weight loss is more likely long term to result in weight gain than weight loss. And that is, as we spoke about at the start, that's a whole piece in of itself. But having that support to be able to advocate for yourself in terms of your health conditions, whether it's PCOS, whether it's diabetes, whatever it is, advocating that you are actually looking after your health. You're not abandoning your health by shifting the method to focusing on health behaviors. You're actually actively recognizing what hasn't served your health well and trying this new approach, which is so much more positive in terms of the research, as a long-term thing that can support your health.
Absolutely. So when you were just thinking, with talking there, something about like health markers, and a phrase about health that I fell in love with a couple of years ago is, my cousin had sent it on to me. Health is, I lost the whole sentence, but it was something like, health is having the capacity to live your life in a meaningful way. And I think with lots of people struggling with chronic conditions, struggling with this desire to be healthy. So one of the first things I ask people, well, what would it feel like to you to be healthy? What are you doing? What are you thinking? What are you seeing every day in your world? And that gives it, because it is a subjective end. That's this health thing. We can get the results from the doctors, and we can get those markers, the science. But even if those figures are there, does that really mean that you feel it? And that comes back into a lot of intuitive eating, is that deep sense of interoceptive awareness. I know we'll know what that means, but that's the felt sense piece.
Yeah, 100%. I know you've got a phrase. I've got a phrase that I love as well. There's obviously must be a piece for phrases. And again, I'm going to be misquoting it, but it's something along the lines of, if the pursuit of health makes you unhealthy, is that a healthy thing to do? Because sometimes we could be pursuing health with such energy, and what we find is actually with such an intense pursuit of health in that way, what are we losing along the way? And as you say, health is subjective. Health is not just the absence of conditions or diseases, which some people have lifelong conditions and diseases, and they are allowed to access their version of health. But it's not just about that physical piece. It's also about your emotional health, your social well-being, your psychological well-being. You're not just, the sum of your physical parts. You're a human being, and that comes into it too, as you say.
So much more. I had a lovely client who shared towards the end of our work together, and I'm proud to share this on her behalf. My body is the least interesting thing about me, and it was just such beautiful words to hear back from somebody when they just made that connection. They have the ability to live their life feeling healthy, no matter what the body is like. I know we could chat for another 2 hours, but I think we might call a halt here. I am so grateful to you, and I know everyone who listens to this will be so grateful to you for coming on and having this conversation with me. Thank you. Again, you will find Aoife at That Irish Dietitian. And what's your website?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of socials. I'm at That Irish Dietitian you can check me out on Instagram, you can check me out on TikTok, and I've recently launched a YouTube. So if you want to head over and follow or subscribe or like, I've got a piece on sugar addiction. So come on over there. And then if you're interested in working with me, you can, feel free to DM or message me, but you can go to my website, which is Center for Liberating Nutrition.com.
And I'm going to ask everyone who listened, if you, like, in the bottom of your heart and the deepest part of your gut, if what we've said resonated, landed, if you felt it, please share this. Give a like to the podcast so that we can spread the message, because we've got lots of generations coming up, growing up, and if we can start changing this narrative within us, then we can change it for the ones coming behind us. And what a legacy that will be, wouldn't it?